Okay, welcome in, folks. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be talking this afternoon a little bit about the Student First Act, originally passed in 2011. My name is Corey Krieger, and we're going to be running through this little PowerPoint I created in the background. Hopefully, this will be informative to you. I did not know a lot about this particular law before doing some research on it this afternoon. Found it to be fairly fascinating. Biggest takeaway right off the top would be this particular law is going to be aimed at changing the arbitration process for tenured employees in the state of Alabama. A very interesting law when it comes to teacher tenure. And kind of how that process plays out. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So kind of a quick overview here. The Student First Act of 2011 is an Alabama law that essentially changed the arbitration process for firing and disciplining teachers within the state. And I'll say this probably multiple times throughout this presentation, the big thing on this law is it gives more power to the superintendents and local school boards. Some would argue an overwhelming amount of power. The goal, according to the law, is to have primary authority and responsibility for having competent educators now falls to the boards of education. So again, kind of to play devil's advocate here, those that are for the law when it came out in 2011 and still now say that the arbitration process was too lengthy. You have court costs that tie up the legal process when it comes to educators, when it comes to the unions, and it made it very difficult to hire and fire teachers. If you're someone that was supportive of the teachers' unions, obviously this can be seen kind of as a power grab. No longer do you have the ability to go through that arbitration process. Your fate, kind of for better or worse, is left up to the local school boards. Now, there are some avenues you can take, as you'll see, whether it be written request, 30-day notices, and even hearings before the board. But depending on whether or not your board is ethical, so to speak, then you have your hands and your fate, even as a tenured teacher, can be tied to your local board of education. So who's covered? Essentially, and this may not be completely correct after doing more reading on this particular slide, basically you're not covered under this if you are if you're a classified employee or like a temporary worker. That would be like summer school aides, temp employees. The superintendents aren't necessarily covered under this because they're usually based on a contractual basis. So essentially, if you work under a board of education, a post-secondary education, the Alabama Institute for the Deaf and the Blind, or the Department of Youth Services, if you're an employee under one of those particular institutions, you can be covered by the Student First Act of 2011. And just some interesting things I found on kind of the protections. Like I said, it deals mainly with tenured employees, but being tenured does not necessarily mean that you have absolute right to any position in the school system. The superintendents can kind of, and the local boards can kind of do with, they have the right to place you where they kind of best see fit. Like, for example, if you don't have the right to a specific position, even if you're a tenured employee, you can't walk in and say, hey, I want to teach 11th grade U.S. history. And if they say no, even as a tenured employee, you don't have the right to an appeal. You can't say, I want to work at the high school. Or I have to be the department head. That's not what tenure does. Tenure kind of stops you from, unjust firings after your third year. So if you have tenure, you are covered under the law. Some people that may not be covered, temporary, substitute, occasional, seasonal, kind of already talked about that. You don't have to have review under this. So that's that's kind of the big takeaway of this is that, those political or personal motivations can still pop up if you're non-tenured. So it does protect you otherwise if you are tenured. So this was interesting, talking about renewals, terminations. Hopefully this is working. Is this working? What is the volume? Okay, let's hope it's working. I clicked that it was, but I don't know. I'm so bad at this. All right, let's hope that it's actually working. Non-renewals, terminations, and certificate actions. Won't get into my personal story, but do know that non-renewal is not termination. When you are non-renewed, if you are slid that white piece of paper, that does not, you still do have rights. You can basically submit a written statement to the superintendent and board within 15 days, basically explaining your side of the story, why an action should not be taken. Ultimately, it is the right of the Board of Education. They don't really have to take that into account. It's just, that's saying this is you kind of defending yourself. If the superintendent makes a call, generally speaking, the Board of Education is going to follow that, especially on a non-tenured teacher. So non-tenured teachers have no appeals rights to the board, and the superintendent doesn't have to give a reason. So again, this is where that, some of this debate on education and ethics of education come in. If you're a non-tenured teacher, the reason why you want to get tenure is where you do have that appeals process and the ability where they can't just get rid of you for no reason. However, again, to play devil's advocate, as a tenured teacher, you see in education oftentimes that people get tenured and they may not be performing the duties or the standards in education like they should. So, but as a tenured teacher, the board does have to provide reasons for a justifiable firing. And these include things like incompetency, failure to perform duties, insubordination, and a host of other reasons. But there is some vague language in there. I think maybe that is to kind of help boards and superintendents possibly get rid of tenured teachers if they're not doing their job. I think the quote was good and just cause, whatever that means. That's vague language. So like I've said, this is one of the many things, the ways that non-renewals and terminations happen. Of course, if you lose your certificate, there's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. If you don't any failure to renew, you're basically can be terminated immediately. So you always have to have your certificate and things of that nature up to date. All right. This I don't really have a problem with. I don't think most educators would have a problem with it. The superintendent has the ability to reassign non-tenured teachers basically as needed, as long as it doesn't result in a loss of pay. As I mentioned before, if the superintendent or board feels you can be helpful elsewhere, then they can reassign you. And you're an employee of the school system. They think you're better in the elementary school. That's their right to do so. So if you're a good employee, this should not bother you. You should basically say, hey, I'm willing to do whatever to help the school system out. If you are, transferred though or reassigned, they do have to give you a written notice of 15 days before the board's vote on that particular transfer. Most people, though, of course, as a good educator, would not have much of an issue with the reassignments and transfers, unless, of course, they were being done for political or personal reasons. Same thing with a suspension. It says suspensions of anyone for less than 20 days gives an employee only rights before the board. Can't stress this enough. If you read through the law, read through the provisions, the boards of education and the superintendents have tremendous power over these particular decisions. They do have to give a reason or in writing why a suspension happens, but you don't get an appeal beyond the board. You can't take it to a lawyer or some sort of arbitration process. Okay. Same deal with a reduction in force. Can't stress enough, reduction in force, whether there's budgetary concerns, whatever it may be, um, you know, essentially these particular reduction in force um, situations do not allow for any type of challenge or review. If there's a termination because of reduction in force, I feel like this would be a point of contention between the labor unions and the advocates for the law, this RIF. The actual language here is a little bit clouded as well, lawyer language for unavoidable reductions beyond normal attrition due to decreased student enrollment, shortage of revenue. So, I mean, you could cite multiple things as a, Board of Education, student enrollment goes down 10 students. Is that considered a decreased student enrollment? Could that justify a reduction in force? Again, the language can be a little bit cloudy there. And you don't have to have any advance notice when it comes to RIF. And they don't have a right to an appeal if the termination or transfers deal with RIF. So you can kind of see why this can be considered a power grab and why some of the unions fought this. But at the same time, and this is kind of my personal summary here, the board and the superintendents have a lot of power that was previously left to the arbitration process. And I'm sure that our arbitration process was costly, cost the taxpayers money, lawyer fees, all those types of things. But, what is the best recourse here? If you've got a good board of education that doesn't abuse its power for personal reasons or doesn't take in nepotism and those types of things, the Student First Act seems like a good idea. But, there's human beings, and human beings can be fallible to power grabs and positional changes and helping someone out here and there, and that's the issue with this seemingly. So whether or not it's unethical, I guess that's the reason why it exists. And it now kind of makes it a lot more clear to me why many of the hirings and firings go down the way that they do. Possibly I was naive to that in my first 8 years in education. So this was really interesting and really eye-opening for me to kind of see how this law works and how it's enacted in the school systems by the boards of education. So a very enlightening afternoon learning about this law. So hopefully you enjoyed this presentation about the Students First Act. Thank you.